For 45 years, the moss has been allowed to creep over 3 white marble headstones in the shadowy corner of the St. Jude's Parish cemetery. The locals of Willow Creek still cross themselves when they pass the iron gates, whispering prayers for the 3 tragic souls supposedly resting beneath that cold earth. They tell their grandchildren the story of the Great Storm of 1968, the night the old bell tower collapsed in a fury of lightning and fire, taking the lives of 3 devoted servants of God. But the locals are praying to empty boxes. There are no bodies in those graves. The truth is not a story of accidental martyrdom or a tragic act of nature. It is a story of a desperate, terrifying flight from a predator who wore the vestments of a shepherd while hunting his own flock. Today, the woman the world once knew as Sister Margaret sits by a window in a dusty Arizona nursing home, watching the sun set on a life built entirely on a lie, ready to finally let the silence burn away. Margaret was the eldest of the 3, a woman of 40 when the darkness first descended upon St. Jude's. In the mid-1960s, the convent was a sanctuary of rhythm and ritual, a place where the scent of beeswax candles and lemon oil polish promised a predictable, holy life. Margaret, along with the gentle, soft-spoken Sister Ruth and the fiery, young novice Sister Beatrice, maintained the orphanage attached to the parish. They were mothers to the motherless, finding God in the scraped knees they bandaged and the warm meals they served. It was a hard life, but a clean one. That cleanliness ended the day Bishop Sterling arrived from the city to oversee the diocese's finances. Sterling was a man of silver hair and silver tongue, possessing a charisma that charmed the wealthy benefactors of the county. He drove a black Cadillac that looked like a hearse and smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke, a scent that would soon trigger a physiological panic in all 3 women. At first, the changes were subtle. He spoke of modernizing the mission, of cutting costs. But Margaret, who possessed a sharp mind hidden beneath her wimple, noticed that while the orphanage's budget for food and coal was slashed, the parish accounts were swelling with mysterious donations that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The atmosphere in the convent shifted from one of quiet devotion to one of suffocating surveillance. Sterling didn't just visit, he invaded. He would arrive unannounced late in the evening, demanding private audiences with the sisters under the guise of spiritual direction. It was Sister Beatrice, only 22, and possessing a beauty she tried desperately to hide, who first became the target of his twisted attention. Margaret began to notice the changes in the young novice, the way Beatrice's hands shook when she poured tea, the way she scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, as if trying to wash away an invisible stain. The horror revealed itself fully on a Tuesday in November. Margaret had stayed up late to balance the pantry ledger when she heard a stifled cry echoing from the bishop's temporary study down the hall. It was a sound of primal fear, sharp and sudden, instantly silenced. Propelled by an instinct she hadn't known she possessed, Margaret moved through the shadows of the cloister. Through the crack in the heavy oak door, she witnessed a scene that shattered her understanding of holy obedience. Bishop Sterling had Beatrice cornered against the dark wood paneling, his hand clamped over her mouth. His voice, a low, serpentine hiss threatening not just her, but the safety of the orphans sleeping upstairs. He told her that if she spoke, the orphanage would be closed, the children scattered to the winds, and her family destroyed. Margaret retreated into the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She found Ruth in the chapel, weeping. They realized then that they were alone. The local police chief was a regular dinner guest of the bishop. The town council was in his pocket. To speak out against a man of Sterling's power in 1968 was to scream into a void. They were women without property, without secular identities, and now without protection. They knew that Beatrice's soul was being murdered by inches, and it was only a matter of time before Sterling's appetite turned toward the children they had sworn to protect. The plan was born not out of courage, but out of sheer, terrifying necessity. It was Ruth, usually the most timid of them, who pointed out the crumbling structural integrity of the old bell tower wing, which was slated for demolition. She noted that a storm was forecast to batter the coast in 3 days, a tempest that would provide the perfect cover for a catastrophe. They spent those 3 days in a haze of nausea and adrenaline, gathering what little cash they had squirreled away in the kitchen tins, stealing clothes from the donation bin intended for the poor, and forging the paperwork that would erase their existence. On the night of the storm, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the stained glass windows. The sisters moved like ghosts through the halls they had polished for years. They staged the scene with meticulous, heartbreaking care. They placed their rosaries and identifiable personal items, Margaret's spectacles, Ruth's prayer book, Beatrice's silver cross, in the room directly beneath the rotting timbers of the tower. Then, with hands trembling so violently they could barely strike the match, they ignited the kerosene-soaked rags in the basement. The fire caught with a roar that rivaled the thunder. As the first alarm bells began to clang in the distance, the 3 women slipped out through the cellar doors into the lashing rain. They did not look back at the only home they had known. They climbed into the beat-up delivery truck Margaret had hidden by the old logging road, a vehicle she had hotwired using knowledge gleaned from a wayward youth she had long since buried. As they sped away, the sky behind them lit up in a terrifying orange glow. A muffled explosion signaled the collapse of the tower, burying the remains of the sisters under tons of burning debris. For the world, that was the end, the tragic fire of St. Jude's. But for Margaret, Ruth, and Beatrice, it was the first breath of a terrifying new life. They drove through the night, crossing state lines, shedding their habits in a roadside ditch miles away, cutting their hair with sewing shears in a gas station bathroom. They became Alice, Mary, and Joan, 3 widows moving west to start over. They worked in diners, in libraries, in laundromats, always looking over their shoulders, always flinching when a police cruiser drove by, always terrified that the power of the bishop could reach beyond the grave. They never married, never fully trusting men again. They remained a family of 3, bound by a secret that was heavier than any vow of silence. They watched from afar as Bishop Sterling eventually rose to become a cardinal, celebrated by the faithful, his dark deeds buried under layers of gold and velvet. It wasn't until the cancer took Ruth 10 years ago, and Beatrice's mind began to fade into the fog of dementia, that Margaret felt the burning need to correct the record. Now, looking at her wrinkled hands, Margaret knows the time for hiding is over. The cardinal is dead, buried with honors he did not earn. But the truth remains alive as long as she breathes. She picks up the pen to write the final letter, to tell the people of Willow Creek that the women they mourned were not victims of a storm, but survivors of a war. They did not die in the fire, they were forged in it. The empty graves stand as a monument not to their death, but to their escape. And as she writes, the 45-year-old weight finally lifts from her chest, leaving her with a peace that no bishop, no convent, and no vow could ever provide.